Recent scientific studies touting the benefits of medical transitioning for those with gender dysphoria are joining the long history of so-called science. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. From the beginning, proponents of the sexual revolution have wrapped themselves in the mantle of science, especially social science. For example, in the 1950s, the Kinsey Reports helped normalize a whole range of sexual behaviors. They were the source of that still often quoted statistic that 10% of people are same-sex oriented. Both that figure and the methodology behind Kinsey's so-called research has long ago been discredited. Still, that 10% number just sticks in some people's heads. A new wave of studies in recent years paint a rosy picture about the benefits of medical transitions for people with gender dysphoria. So much so that, as Paul Dirks recently said at Public Discourse, lifelong experimental medicalization, sterilization, and complete removal of healthy body parts no longer a rarity. It's now the recommended treatment for gender dysphoria. But what if those studies are like the Kinsey Reports? What if they reflect the bias and agendas of the authors rather than reality? Well, given what's at stake, this is a vitally important question, especially since social science itself is in the midst of what's called a replication crisis. In other words, when researchers try to replicate the findings of studies in the social sciences, they often cannot. This failure of replication even includes studies regarded as canonical in some fields. So how can we distinguish between what's solid research and what won't withstand further scrutiny when it comes to the so-called settled science of gender transitioning? Paul Dirks' Public Discourse article, titled "Transition as Treatment, the Best Studies Show the Worst Outcomes," sums up the results of his deep dive into this research. Dirks defines best studies as those that have followed people who underwent medical transition for the longest period of time. It's well recognized in the literature, Dirks states, that the year after medical gender transition is a, quote, honeymoon period, which does not represent a realistic picture of long-term sexual and psychological status. Yet, most of the popular gender transition studies are limited to just a few years following the transitioning. Other studies that support medical transition fail to follow up with as many as half of the original participants. That's well beyond the threshold of reliability. Many of the studies, Dirks states, are fraught with design problems like small sample sizes, short study lengths, enormously high dropout rates, to name just three. The problem's so bad, one systematic review of the literature rated only 2 out of 29 studies as high quality. In contrast, the best designed and most rigorous studies, whose results are most likely to stand up over time, found that medical transition was not the solution to the patient's problems, especially in the case of male to female transitions. They reveal much higher mortality rates due to increased rates of suicide, AIDS, drug abuse, even cardiovascular disease. Another high-quality study found a 7-fold increase in suicide attempts and a 19-fold increase in completed suicides after transitions. Even when the findings are adjusted for pre-existing psychiatric problems, which are often treated as unrelated to the gender dysphoria, there's still a 3-fold increase in psychiatric hospital admissions. In other words, when it comes to medical gender transitioning, the best studies show the worst outcomes. And the current use of shoddy social science to support medical transitioning, that's not only misleading, it's dangerous. In this case, as is common in the social sciences, especially throughout the history of the sexual revolution, ideology is overwhelming truth-finding. Too many researchers think they know what the data should tell us, and so they at times unconsciously and at times consciously design their studies to make sure that it does. Sadly, the consequences of their failure is far worse than professional embarrassment or tarnished reputations. In this case, the consequences could be permanent and deadly. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.